Stephen Dale is an attorney and disability rights advocate. He spends much of his time attending disability rights activities, including legislative hearings and servings on boards of committees of disability rights organizations like the ARC of California and the Contra Costa Developmental Disabilities Council. He teaches courses to the public, financial professionals, and other attorneys on special needs trusts and trust administration, with a special emphasis on achieving independence while maintaining essential government benefits. He's a frequent speaker on a variety of disability-related topics across the country. He's a longstanding member of the Special Needs Alliance, which is a not-for-profit organization of attorneys dedicated to the practice of disability and public benefits law. And he is also a trustee of the Golden State Pooled Trust. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing, allow Steve to share his screen.
And just one question, were you able to get the recording going?
We are recording.
My name is Steve Dale here, and I am I'm an attorney who's been doing this work for about 30 years. I'm also the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. And a lot of what I want to talk about tonight is not just the trust, but the importance of the trustee and different options and that kind of thing. The website there at gspt.org, and I think we'll be giving you some other information as well. One thing, if you go to that website, we have all sorts of videos on all sorts of different subjects. Because, part of, and this is why PHP is so important, part of being a parent or a advocate for a person with a disability it's a constant learning job, learning to keep up with things. And it's kind of like going to a university that you never actually graduate from because there's just so much to learn. And that's one of the reasons why PHP is so important. In fact, I've probably been teaching in PHP for at least 25 years. Used to do it in Sunnyvale years ago when they were there. So be that as it may, we got a lot to cover. We're going to take questions at the end here. I will stop at 7:30 and we'll be able to have about 15, 20 minutes for questions and then we'll move on. Okay, so let me go through this as best I can. So here's one of the things that when we start talking about special needs trusts, a lot of people think of these like they're a commodity, like I need to get one of these things. And if I get a special needs trust, all of my problems will be solved. And that would be really nice if that were true, but that's just not how it works. So part of what I want to go through with you is not just what is the trust and how does it work and how does it work with CalABLE. We're going to get to all of that. But the other part of that is, I want to share with you my experience over the last 30 years about, learning about when these trusts work and when they don't work. Okay. And we can also maybe later talk about when you're looking for a trustee or for an attorney. And by the way, I'm not doing this to try to get clients here. I mean, if we get a few clients, that's nice. But part of this is I want to give you helpful information. So, wherever your community is, you can find somebody that's going to serve you and your family. So when somebody's asked to describe what a special needs trust is, they usually say, well, the reason is to stay eligible for public benefits. And it's not that the public benefits aren't important, but if you think about it, if you only focus on preservation of benefits, you're really missing the big picture, because when it comes down to providing for the needs of a person with a disability, here, our true objective really should be to maximize the quality of life for a person with a disability. And the benefits are just a tool. And sometimes they're really useful. And sometimes, quite frankly, the benefits can be harmful. And so I kind of want to go through that a bit as we go through it. The objective of most families that we work with is to provide the best quality of life possible, and to promote independence and freedom from abuse and neglect. Once again, we should say, when we're talking about working with a person with a disability, one of the challenges is that they're all individuals. Like my friend Brian Rubin says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I mean, they're all individuals, and that's part of the challenge. Maintaining benefits should only be looked at as a tool And really, and in fact, in a lot of cases, for instance, sometimes the objective is to get them off of public benefits through different workability programs and that kind of thing. Special needs trust and ABLE accounts, we're going to touch on those too, are financial tools that one can use to maintain eligibility for benefits, but the focus really should be on enhancing the quality of life. And that's important not only in the document, but it's also important whenever you choose a trustee or that sort of thing. So I like to illustrate it this way. And for many of you, this is not going to be hard for you to imagine. Imagine that you have a daughter, and let's say her name is Kathy, and let's say she has a significant disability. Now, as I said, these folks are individuals. We have a lot of self-advocates that just do a fine job of advocating for themselves. Most of the families we work with, their loved ones really need some level of assistance somehow. So let's say in this case, we really expect that Kathy's going to need some level of assistance for the rest of her life. So you come to the estate planning attorney and provide for her needs in the event of your incapacity or death here, and you get the trust all put together. And, let's say Kathy has autism. To my knowledge, nobody's ever died of autism. So like if Kathy is 17 years old, and let's say you get the trust put together and you pass away, this trust could be under an administration for 70 years. So the thing you have to look at is, what are the challenges we're likely to see over the next 70 years? And, for instance, if I were doing the full 2-hour program, which we definitely don't have time today, I would go through about a 30-minute segment on the basics of public benefits. And by the way, we have videos on the basics of public benefits. But see, those would be the rules as they are in 2022. Now, if we were all in the room together, I would ask you, how many of you think that the rules will stay the same for the next 5 years or 10 years or 70 years? And the answer is they're not going to stay the same. They're going to change. Social service systems may change. And for many of us that have children or loved ones, for instance, with developmental disabilities, we're very blessed to have the Lanterman system, which provides arguably some of the best programs in the state, in the country. Why do we have them? Well, it's because of the advocacy of parents and also from the knowledge you gain from programs like Parents Helping Parents. But to think that they're always going to be the same, you're just kidding yourself. We were just talking before this about how much things have changed in the last 25 years. I've been doing this for 60 years, so they certainly have changed a lot. Her condition may change. These folks are not static. Some exceed your expectations, some don't. Just because you have a disability doesn't mean that something else could come up. And the other thing we're dealing with is a lot of people with disabilities are living longer than they ever did. And so we're learning about aging and disability. Her advocacy system may change. And that's one of the reasons oftentimes, especially when we have the parent advocate. I know a lot of the families we work with, their objective is to make sure that they're going to have that solid advocacy for the rest of their life, even upon the death or incapacity of the parents. Attitudes about disability certainly have changed over the 60 years, some for the good, some for the bad, but they do change. Question I get all the time is, how much do I need to set aside for my child? And the answer is, I have no idea, because there are so many different factors out there. And part of it, especially if we're dealing with developmental disabilities, a lot of it has to do with whether or not the Lanterman system will continue and provide, adequate resources. Right now, even though our system is having its problems, it provides pretty good resources. But if you go to a state like Colorado, where they have waiting lists of, 20 years or longer, things do change. Trustee options, which is where I'm going to spend a fair amount of time, because the biggest issue about whether a special needs trust is going to meet its objective or not, I'm sorry to tell you, is not the who drafted your trust. It's your choice of trustee or management system. And we're going to talk about that as well. So as far as it being and I'm going to just skip this slide because that's okay. So now the other thing you need to think of when you're doing this planning, when you're sitting down with your attorney, okay, is that a special needs trust should not only provide that support upon your death or your passing here, but the other part is, what if you become part of the disability community? You know, for many of the clients we work with here, both with the Golden State Pool Trust and the Dale Law Firm, a lot of the focus is making sure that happens, that they have that protection upon their death. But the issue is, what if you become incapacitated? What if something happens to you? And sometimes that's the most difficult thing to deal with, because like most families, you really need to look at who is going to continue to be that advocate for your child. What kind of supports are you giving, and that are, you know, what can you continue to do? And the other thing is, most of us do not have unlimited budgets, and oftentimes we have to talk to our trustees about how are they going to take the resources that you have and basically split them between your needs and your child's needs and needs of your other children and that sort of thing. So it's not just upon death, it's also upon your incapacity. I'm going to go through just a little quick primer on the basics of public benefits here, just to talk a little bit about the different benefits. We don't have time to get really deep in the woods, but if you take a look at public benefits, they basically come into two categories. So the first category is what are called needs-based programs. So those are things like the SSI, Medi-Cal, which is called Medicaid in other states, food stamps, legal aid, utility payments, housing subsidies, and HUD programs. What's common with those programs is that you have to show a need based on disability and financial need. And so, you know, for most of those programs, you have to have limited income and resources. Those are what are called the needs-based programs. The other types of programs are what are called entitlements. And those are programs like Social Security disability insurance, which includes childhood disability benefits and disability insurance benefits, Medicare, and special education. For those programs, you need to show a need based on disability, but your child can win the lottery and it's not going to interfere with their qualifications for public benefits. So on the needs-based benefits, part of this is that for those programs like SSI and Medi-Cal, you can only have limited income and resource. So what's a resource? Okay, and we're talking about resources your child has access to. So anything you convert into cash for support is a resource. And for SSI purposes, if your resources exceed $2,000 on the first day of the calendar month, the beneficiary's public benefits, their SSI, will be lost until the resources are reduced. Now, we just had a recent change in Medi-Cal. So if you're getting Medi-Cal without the SSI, the resource limit just went up to $130,000. But for SSI, which is what most folks get, the resource limit is $2,000. So both special needs trusts and ABLE accounts can be used to maintain eligibility without interfering with public benefits. Now, the reason it does that, and I think it's important to understand that, is not that the trust does something magic, but if you keep your the concept of what a resource is, and the fact that if your child has access to more than $2,000, they lose access to their SSI, then the trust is going to make a little bit more sense. Now, so before we can explore special needs trusts, we got to discuss trusts in general. So they seem like these mysterious, mystical documents, but all a trust is a contract to meet a certain objective. So for instance, one of the most common trusts you see out there is a living trust. A living trust is a contract you make with yourself or with your spouse to, for instance, hold your property so that it passes your property by contract law not probate law, and isn't subject to probate. Some trusts are established for management purposes, some for tax planning, and others to accomplish social objectives. So with that in mind, what is a special needs trust? So the Social Security Administration defines resources as any cash or personal property that an individual owns or has the power to convert it into cash. So it has to do with what they have access to without control. If an SSI recipient does not own an asset outright and is legally restricted from directing the funds, those assets are not considered a resource for benefits purposes. So what does that mean? So what a special needs trust really is, it's a contract where the trustee has sole and absolute discretion over the assets of the trust and the beneficiary has none. In essence, it's a form of what's called a spendthrift trust. So a spendthrift trust is a trust where the trustee, for instance, I am the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust and I have 250 beneficiaries. I have absolute control over the assets and the beneficiary has none. Therefore, you could put millions of dollars in that trust and it won't interfere with SSI or Medi-Cal eligibility. By directing the assets that were intended for the individual into the trust, you're preventing them from being counted as a resource. Now, let me take a pause real quick. Anybody got a problem with that? Because if you think about it, you work really hard to enable your disabled loved one to have as much control of their life as possible. But then we turn around and set up these trusts where they have no control over the trust and it's in somebody else's hands. Now, in some cases, that might be the objective. In some cases, maybe that's not the objective, but it's just something you have to do. But it's one of those things you really want to think about, especially if your objective is for your loved one or whoever you're setting this up for, is to have as much control over their life. It's something you really have to take into consideration. As we get into the ABLE Act and how that works with special needs trusts, that provides an acceptable alternative for many people. So when we're talking about estate planning trusts, which are called third-party trusts, they have a lot of latitude. And upon the death of the beneficiary, you can leave the remainder of the trust to anyone you want, except you can't leave it to the drafting attorney because the state bar really frowns on that. Now, there's a different kind of trust we're not going to talk about tonight, which is called a litigation trust or a self-settled trust. Those have liens on them upon death. On the estate planning trust here, that upon the death of the beneficiary, you can name anyone you want. You can name a child, you can name PHP, you can name the ARC, you can name anyone you want upon death. And there is no lien because they never owned the asset. Now, I'm going to make one correction here because it does say the process of creating your estate plan with the Dale Law Firm. And this is the process we use. But what I really want to emphasize is, like, when you're doing your planning, whether you work with us or another law firm, and there are some really fine law firms out there, okay? I'm honestly not out here looking for clients here. In fact, I will warn you, if you do call the office, we're about 6 to 8 weeks behind right now. This is a very busy time here. But let's walk through the process. If you kind of divide this up into 4 parts, this will make sense. So the first one is to figure out what you want the trust to do. And we're going to talk about how you're going to do that and then what you're going to incorporate in the trust and what you're going to put in a letter of intent, that kind of thing. The next thing after that is choosing a management system. I'm here to tell you the biggest factor about whether these trusts succeed or not is what kind of management system or trustee are you going to select. After that, you may have a great trust with a great trustee, but if you don't put something in that trust, it's not going to do very much at all. Now, the last part is no matter what happens, these trusts are not stagnant. So you've got to make sure there's a system within that trust, not just during your lifetime, but upon your death or incapacity. It's going to look at the situation and make sure that what we're doing is making sense. So, like for step one here, the reason that it's so important to express your intent, either in the document or in a letter of intent, is that someday there may be some trustee who's going to manage this thing, and they may have no idea who you are. And if all that trust says is keep my kid on public benefits, well, we didn't really tell them very much at all. A bare bones trust is only going to accomplish limited objectives. Remember, this trust could go on for a long time. So we need to speak to that trustee, literally from the grave, here about what is it that you want that trustee to do. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. In this, the special needs trust should have broad information about it, about what is it you really want to focus on. Are you focused on housing? Are you focused on vocational needs? Are you focused on recreation? What is the focus? With that, you can tie that to a letter of intent, which can give more detailed information. Think of the letter of intent kind of as a journal here. And a lot of my clients will set up the letter of intent and just start it now and then just keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it up here. And, oftentimes you have some really good information that's going to be useful to the trustee someday. Now, the second part is finding the ideal trustee. And I'm going to have to skip through a few slides here. But if you kind of think about this trustee, this person or entity that's going to be in charge of managing the trust, what is it we want them to do? So first off, we want to make sure that they really understand the needs of the beneficiary. And not only that, a lot of times, when you're dealing with advocacy for somebody with a disability, it's one of those things that's not intuitive to folks. I'm sure that you have probably changed over time with a loved one with a disability, and your attitudes have probably changed too. And, a lot of times we're trying to focus on, how can we have the best life possible? We have to understand the public benefits and keep up with the law. Ideally, your trustee should be able to do that. Now, it doesn't mean they have to understand everything about benefits, but they need to definitely understand when to ask for help. They need to wisely invest and conform to statutory fiduciary requirements. In most cases, this money needs to be invested, and you might notice that the market is kind of going up and down and that kind of thing. But we want to make sure we have the correct investments over time. This is a long-term game because, of course, we want to get a return on the investments. The taxation of the trust is a very important part of a special needs trust. And ideally, if you have a trustee that understands taxation, they can make sure things are done tax-wise. Especially when somebody is on needs-based benefits, they have to keep really perfect books. And that is so important as well, especially if they're on SSI. These trusts do get audited from time to time, and we need to make sure that the expenditures were for the proper things. One thing that's important, and I try to incorporate either with family or national supports who are in tune with this or with professional care managers, is that, many of our folks are very vulnerable, and we want to make sure that there's somebody on the team that checks on them on a regular basis and can pick up when we have a situation where there could be abuse or neglect. Now, here's the hardest part of this, because, hey, I'm 70 years old and I serve as a trustee for 250 people. Would I be the perfect choice as a person for your child for a 17-year-old? Well, I'm here to tell you, I'm probably not going to live for 70 years. So we got to make sure that the trustee is immortal. So how are you going to do that? Well, if you look at it this way, there is really no such thing as the perfect trustee. To me, if you kind of take that list, and I'll put these up, and kind of divide it into different spheres, then you can achieve what I call the perfect trustee. Now, how you divide it up almost doesn't matter. It really has to do with, we're setting up a checks and balance system here. But if you kind of put the advocacy stuff in one sphere, that's dealing with the discretion, and that includes public benefits, because sometimes it has to do with when do we want to maintain the benefits and when are we better off without them. And somebody that can be really in tune with, like, I was a nurse for 17 years working with severely disabled folks. And, even a nonverbal person will give you visual clues when something's wrong. A lot of parents will pick that up. We need somebody who's in tune with that. Then we have the accountability side and the financial side. So let me run through a couple of models real quick because of time. I'm not going to go through every one. This is the most common model that we suggest. Now, by the way, here, we're suggesting this model. A lot of people will just want to make their sons or daughters the trustee. And if that's what you really want to do, well, you're the client and all that. But I'm suggesting that in many cases, rather than making them the trustee, we might want to consider something else. So this model that I'll focus on, and then I'm going to skip a couple of them here just before time, is we might have a trustee, a professional trustee, and it could be like a private professional fiduciary. And you have a lot of really fine private professional fiduciaries in Northern California, with a care manager that can be used on occasion here when needed, who will go out and do assessments as needed, one to help the trustee, and as we're going to see the advisory committee, make sure, figure out what is really needed and do what we call distribution plans, which is come up with an annual budget here about what we're going to spend the funds on. And that would be overseen by either an advisory committee or a trust protector. The main difference between an advisory committee and a trust protector is a trust protector is usually a single person. An advisory committee is a group. Now, we often suggest that maybe instead of your son or daughter being the trustee here, have them be the chair of an advisory committee. And what the advisory committee would do is it would work with this annual budget, and it would also help direct the trustee about what is needed for the beneficiary, and can amend the trust as laws change and replace the trustee as needed. We're going to see a lot of changes and options for trustees of special needs trust. Once again, I am the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. That's one of many options. There are private fiduciaries, there are corporate trustees. Fremont Bank, for instance, handles a lot of these trusts. There's many options. I've been doing this for 30 years. I have seen a lot of changes. I have seen trustees come. I have seen trustees go here. So it's one of those things that by setting up this checks and balance system, this has worked really well for us. Now, even if you decide, well, that sounds nice, but I'm going to go ahead and make my child the trustee, you might give them the option of hiring a professional trustee if it gets to be a greater burden than they can handle. And this is something you should be able to talk with your attorney about what option makes sense for you. I'm going to skip this slide here. I will mention this real quick. I am the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. And by the way, there are other pool trusts in California. We're getting more and more folks. A pool trust is kind of like a cross between a 401k and a special needs trust. You don't get your own document, but if you use it in the traditional sense, you get an account set up, and then otherwise it's managed by any other, like any other special needs trust. That's all fine. Now, we actually administer standalone special needs trust, and many other pool trusts do the same thing. And in that case, in the right situation, and it really depends on your situation, that might be a good option, because oftentimes, in many cases, a pool trust may be a really good option. It may be a little less expensive, not always here, especially if you don't need the trustee to go visit them on a regular basis, because most pool trusts, including the Golden State Pool Trust, are call centers. We actually don't meet the beneficiaries. We have to work through somebody like a care manager or an advisory committee. So anyway, the point being, and we could easily spend a full hour on choosing a trustee, the point of it is when you're exploring doing your trust, it's not just getting the document done, but it's exploring different options about who's going to serve as the trustee. Now, once you get that all put together, you need to fund the trust. You got to put something in the trust usually after you pass away. There are situations where you might fund it beforehand, but we're going to assume that this is post-mortem after you've passed away here. And it can be funded with real estate. A lot of the trusts we're doing now are holding houses because, as we all know, housing is the greatest issue we deal with, second to nothing. Sometimes they'll hold investments, or they'll hold the proceeds from retirement plans. Once again, you need to properly fund it. And the other part of that is you need to be really realistic that these things do cost money to manage here. And so, I would urge you not to try to underfund these things if you can, because once again, it can make things pretty difficult. So you kind of consider the trust as the vehicle and the trustee is the driver, but you got to put some gas in this thing or it's not going to go anywhere. So one of the biggest mistakes we see with special needs trust is that you get the trust put together, but you got to make sure when you work with your attorney and you're working with a financial advisor that all the assets that are supposed to go into the trust are going to be properly titled into the trust. If you don't do that, you went to all that trouble, and the funding will probably go directly to the beneficiary, and then it's going to end up in the conservatorship, and you're going to have judges and attorneys managing your funds, and I'm here to tell you that's not the best plan. So the last thing real quick, and then I want to spend about 15 minutes on ABLE accounts is, I hear all the time, how often should this be reviewed by my attorney? And the answer really is, it depends, right? So that may not be really satisfying. So let me just kind of go through things you might look at, and I jumped the gun there. So I suggest, and on our website, and we'll make sure that you get a link to our YouTube site, we actually have a video that kind of goes through things you might want to look at with your special needs trust once a year and do a self-check. And normally that's looking at things like making sure that all of the assets are properly titled into the trust, making sure that whoever you named as trustee is up to date, who's going to be the remainder beneficiaries, and that kind of thing. Quite frankly, we haven't seen a big change in public benefits laws in quite a while, or special needs laws, although it may come up, you never know. It's important to have your financial and tax advisor help you to make sure that all your assets are titled in the trust properly. And so in a lot of cases, involving your advisor is a really good thing to do. Now, in the last 20 minutes before we get to questions and answers, let's talk about the ABLE Act, okay? So the ABLE Act, and some of this because of time, because I want to get into the meat of this, it started in 2014. California's program started about 2017, took a little bit of time to get it going. It allows states to create tax advantage programs. One thing about ABLE programs is they grow tax-free here. And the other part of that is the funds in an ABLE account are safe from federal and state income taxes if they're spent on what are called qualified disability expenses. We're going to get to that in a minute. In the right situation, it gives the benefit and a level of freedom to beneficiaries and special needs trusts not previously available. By the way, on our YouTube channel, I think we have 17 videos on the ABLE Act. It was actually created to have a simple solution. I don't think the words simple and disability are two words that go together, not in my world. So who's eligible? You must be disabled before the age of 26. Now, you might ask yourself why. And the reason is when they first tried to pass this thing, it almost didn't pass because what's called the CBO score, and because it would have cost the government too much money. So they set this as an artificial number. There's actually a chance it'll go up to 46 next year. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it's 26. Now, if your child has a developmental disability, then you don't need to worry at all because by definition, the disability began before the age of 18. You have to be eligible, meet the same criteria as if you were on SSI or SSDI. Although, oddly enough, you don't have to be on those programs or even have been getting those programs before the age of 26. You can do what's called the self-certification. So let's say you're in a situation where maybe you are disabled and maybe let's say you have schizophrenia. It's very rare that somebody has schizophrenia that didn't start before 26, but maybe you didn't get your benefits till 30. Well, there's a very easy self-certification process where you can basically sign a certification that if needed, I'll get a physician to write a letter. You don't even need the letter that that the person was disabled before the age of 26. Now, the amount you can put into an ABLE account, and we're waiting for the new numbers for next year, but right now you can put up to $16,000 a year in an ABLE account. It probably will go up next year, but we're still waiting. You can put up to $100,000 in an ABLE account without it affecting your SSI. But then if you're not on SSI, you can put up to $529,000. Remember, that's at $16,000 out of pop here. So it would take many years to get to that point. But you can put, for instance, in a CalABLE account, you could put up to a total of $529,000 into an ABLE account. Okay. Before the ABLE account, a person with a disability could not save more than $2,000 without impacting your SSI. And now, once again, you can put up to $16,000 a year, up to $100,000 before it affects the SSI, and then up to a $529,000 before it affects the Medi-Cal. So, if the beneficiary once again surpasses that $100,000, then the SSI goes into suspension here, and when the assets drop below $100,000 here, then the SSI benefits resume. Now, let me just give you a clue. Because of time, we couldn't really get deep into the woods about public benefits. But if your child was disabled before the age of 22, and if you're placing assets, if you're putting, paying your money into the FICA and getting Social Security yourself, upon your death, retirement, or if you start drawing Social Security yourself, your child will be on a program called Childhood Disability Benefits. So for many of you, by the time you pass away, your kid won't be on the SSI anyhow. And this is something you should explore. Okay. So the cool thing is if it goes into suspension, you don't have to reapply. A program is not treated as a qualified ABLE account unless it provides that no contribution can be accepted other than cash. So you can only put cash in an ABLE account. In a special needs trust, you can put virtually anything in it here. But if you leave, you can't put stocks or bonds or appreciated stocks in an ABLE account. If you left that for them and wanted to put it in the ABLE account, you'd have to cash it out. Yeah. Eligible individuals can only have one ABLE account. Accounts can function much like savings accounts, depending on how much you want to use the account. And they're tax exempt as long as you use the qualified exemptions. I'm going to skip this. So what is a qualified disability exemption? So any expense related to the designated beneficiary as a result of them living their life with a disability is a qualified disability. And the categories are intentionally broad. In fact, it's almost easier to describe what is not a qualified disability exempt expense. As far as we can tell, gambling is not a qualified disability expense. Buying illegal drugs is not a qualified disability expense. Here, to our knowledge, nobody has ever been dinged for making a wrong distribution. I've never heard of it. If the funds are spent on a non-qualified disability expense, it could be subject to a 10% penalty, but it would only be for this. It would only happen if they were audited by the IRS and the IRS happened to ask questions about how was the ABLE account used. To our knowledge, this has not happened one time in the United States. We don't have a single case where that's come up. let's just face it, these folks don't go through tax audits a lot. So it's not that you shouldn't follow the rules, but on the other hand, nobody, quite frankly, is policing them. So this goes through all the long list you see up until the very last one. That is what is in the ABLE Act itself about what are qualified disability expenses. When they were interpreting this, the IRS who oversees this basically said, to heck with this, a qualified disability expense is any basic living expense, including food or shelter here for the beneficiary's needs. Well, I mean, what is not a basic living expense? I mean, that opens it up to just about anything. So it's really broad about what it can be used. Notice that basic living expenses include food, and it should say shelter in that. So I'm going to show you something really interesting. Okay, well, we'll get to that. So who can open up an ABLE account? The eligible individual can do it. By the way, so we're going to talk about who can open it and who has signature authority and who can qualify for it. It can be opened by an agent under a power of attorney. It can be opened up by a conservator or legal guardian. It can be opened up by a representative payee. If you're the person with the disabilities representative payee for SSI here, then you have the power to do it. It can be established by a spouse, parent, sibling, or grandparent. A lot of the materials you'll read may not have this because that just changed last year, and materials don't always keep up with it. So it's pretty broad who can set it up. And we have the same list of who can have signature authority or have control over the account. And by the way, the assumption always is that the beneficiary, the eligible individual, has capacity. And unless you prove otherwise, that they can ask for control over those accounts. In many cases, that's a good thing. Sometimes that's not so good. So unless the able beneficiary lacks capacity, they have the first priority to manage the account regardless of who established the account or who has signature authority. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say Fred and Wilma have a daughter named Pebbles who was born with a severe developmental disability. Fred and Wilma establish an ABLE account under their authority as Pebbles' parents. No problem. Pebbles lacks authority to manage her account or to execute signature authority. Fred and Wilma maintain signature authority over the account as their parents. So far, so good. Fred and Wilma pass away in a tragic accident, and their neighbors and best friends, Barney and Betty, step up and take care of Pebbles. In order for Barney and Betty to assume signature authority over Pebbles' account, if she doesn't have capacity, is they would have to become her guardian or conservator. Now, the point of this is you really want to think about these accounts and how they're going to be used. Sometimes they're used as savings accounts, which is fine. I'm going to show you some other uses. A lot of the uses that we use them as in and out accounts, money in, money out, and I'm going to illustrate that in just a moment. So as far as who can manage the account, if the individual of the ABLE account has capacity, and they may be challenged, but that doesn't mean they don't have capacity. They can have the power to manage it, or they can assign somebody with the power of attorney. If you determine the account's right for you, if the beneficiary has capacity to manage her own account, then have them sign a power of attorney in the event that they lose capacity in the future. If the designated beneficiary lacks capacity to manage the account and you have signature authority, think about how you're going to have some way to have a successor take over in the event of your incapacity or death. Now, federally, with ABLE accounts, in most states, there's a lien for any Medi-Cal you've used, and that would be the center for any Medi-Cal you've used from the time the trust was established. Okay, now, CalABLE passed a law, basically, and it will only be for CalABLE, that if you open up a CalABLE account upon the beneficiary's death, they will not collect the lien. There will be no payback. Now, if you use another state's program, like for instance, Ohio has a very a popular program. If there are funds left over in the ABLE account, there's certain things they can be used for upon death, burial expenses and that kind of thing. But after that, there's a lien on it for any Medi-Cal they've used from the time the trust has been established. A third-party trust has no lien because it was never owned by the beneficiary. So the last thing I want to illustrate, I want to give you an example about how a special needs trust and an ABLE account can work together, is let's go back to SSI and let's talk a little bit about income for a moment. Okay, now for folks that are on SSI, and the rules are very similar for Medi-Cal here, but we're going to talk mostly about SSI. If you give somebody any cash directly, it'll reduce their benefits dollar for dollar, and that's just not going to work. Okay. If they earn it, they lose $1 for every $2 they earn after the first 65 $5. So if they earn $265 in the month of October, we don't count the first $65, and they would reduce their benefits by $100. We're still $150, $100 bucks ahead of $165 ahead if you do the math. But here's the one that's most perplexing. If you pay for your child's food and shelter and they're on SSI, whether you do it by paying the rent directly, or let's say you just don't charge the fair market rent, SSI says, cool, we don't have to give them all this money. We're going to reduce their benefits by $330.33 a month. Why are they doing that? The reason is SSI is technically 1/3 for food, 1/3 for shelter, and 1/3 for clothing, which we don't count anymore. These rules are kind of archaic and a little bit on the nut side. So the concept is if they can't pay their fair share of their household expenses and somebody helps them, they're going to reduce their public benefits, which is kind of cuckoo if you think about it, but that's the way it goes. So let's look at how you can use an ABLE account here to pay somebody's rent and avoid that $330.33 monthly reduction. And some of you may be having this issue already, so I'm going to show you a way to possibly save $3,000 a year. And here's the sad thing, you don't even need an attorney to do it. So there you go. So let's say Belinda's been disabled from birth and she's receiving $1,040.21 in SSI, which is the current amount that most SSI recipients are getting if they're getting the full amount. She's a beneficiary of a third-party trust. Let's say it's managed by the Golden State Pool Trust. Here, why not? She'd like to move to a nicer apartment, and it would cost, and by the way, I don't think you're going to find an apartment for $1,100 a month here in Santa Clara, for instance. Maybe you would get a room for that. So maybe it's a shared living situation. But whatever it is, let's say the fair market value of that place is $1,100 a month. Now, she's going to have a really hard time paying that rent if she's only getting $1,040 a month here. So how are we going to make this work? So she's going to need some assistance in order to make that move. So now let's say Bob, her friendly trustee, were to give her $1,100 a month directly. That's to be counted as unearned income, and that's just going to wipe out her SSI. So that's not going to work. Let's say if Bob were to pay the landlord directly, we're still going to take that. By the way, it's $300.33. I'm sorry, the numbers got screwed up here. But she's still going to take that $300 and change reduction because the trust paid it. But here's the cool thing. Let's say instead Bob were to contribute that money in the CalABLE account, and in turn the funds from the account were used to pay the landlord. There would be no reduction in the SSI. And you might go, why? Well, the reason is the moment that money hits the CalABLE account, it became Belinda's money, and now Belinda is paying her rent with her own money, and they don't reduce her benefits for that. Now, I know I went through this pretty quickly, but we'll make sure that for our PHP folks here that we'll make sure we get a link to some of the videos that explain this in more detail. But that's one area where an ABLE account can be really useful, if for no other reason, to help with the rent. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly here. We'll make sure you get a link to this. There's a couple of really useful things. The ABLE National Resource Center has got a wealth of information. They're constantly working on materials. And by the way, they're doing some special programs this month for Able to Work programs, going through examples about how people have used ABLE accounts and special needs trusts to help with vocational needs. Anyway, I'm just going to thumb through this, but these are this is an example of something that is on the ABLE National Resource Center that goes through a comparison about different kinds of trust here and how they work with ABLE accounts and some of the pros and cons of each. What we found is in many situations, by combining special needs trusts and ABLE accounts, we can get the best of both worlds here. And just because of time, I just don't have time to go through this, but I think you're going to find this pretty useful. Now, just in like a 1 minute closing here, and then I see, oh, we only have 49 questions. Oh boy, which I only have 20 minutes, guys. So we're going to do the best we can to get through this here. You know, part of this is what I hope you got out of this presentation is just kind of an idea of what is a special needs trust and what are the challenges. Just to repeat this, and by the way, let me mention how you might look for an attorney. Almost every attorney has a software program. We don't sit down and just type out the trust from the beginning. That's not how it works. I happen to be the author of a software program that about 20,000 offices use across the country called Elder Counsel and Wealth Counsel. I wrote the special needs module and keep that up. But it's not the document. When you're looking for an attorney, of course, you want to find somebody that's reasonable, if there is such a thing. Here. But the other part of that is when you're interviewing them, think of it as more than a document. You're buying the experience of the law firm. So when you call them and ask, you should ask them, what kind of experience do you have in the actual administration of the trust? Do you counsel trustees? Because I'm here to tell you, when the attorney, I know when I first started doing this 30 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing and there wasn't anybody to learn from. Here, and I picked up a lot over time. You know, today there's lots of attorneys out there, but you don't want to just buy a document. You're buying the experience of that law firm. And so if they're experienced in the actual counseling folks or administering the trust, they're going to be a lot better advocate for you, and they're going to give you more practical experience. Choice of trustee, extremely important, and that's something you really should explore. And I'm not saying you shouldn't involve family. I believe that you should, but there's different ways of doing that. And if you think about it, in a lot of cases, whether they're disabled or not, a sibling managing the life of another sibling is kind of a natural thing. On the other hand, in the real world, here, oftentimes siblings are incredibly valuable when it comes to the well-being of a person with a disability.
We want to thank Steve for coming and thank everyone else for taking your time.